In 1907, before the first rays of sunlight reached the narrow streets of Hanoi, an elderly street vendor quietly walked through the city, carrying a wooden shoulder pole. Suspended from one end was a heavy pot of broth that had been simmering through the entire night. From the other hung baskets filled with fresh rice noodles, herbs, bowls, and thin slices of beef. There were no restaurants waiting for customers, no famous chefs, no newspaper headlines announcing the arrival of a new dish. Just a man, a recipe, and a city that had no idea it was about to witness the birth of one of history's greatest foods. Today, millions of people know this dish by a single name: pho. It is served in luxury restaurants in Paris, crowded food courts in Singapore, family kitchens in Australia, and busy streets across North America. Every day, countless bowls are prepared around the world, comforting people with the same rich aroma that first drifted through the streets of northern Vietnam more than a century ago. But almost everything people believe about pho's origin is surrounded by mystery. No one knows exactly who created it. No one can point to the first bowl ever served. And no historical record identifies the person whose simple recipe would one day become Vietnam's national treasure. For decades, historians have debated where pho truly began. Some insist it was born in the textile town of Nam Dinh, where hard-working laborers needed an inexpensive but filling breakfast before sunrise. Others believe the dish first appeared in the bustling streets of Hanoi, where traveling vendors slowly transformed a simple bowl of noodles into something unforgettable. The truth is that both places played an important role. Yet pho itself could never have existed without an even greater story. A story that began long before anyone had ever heard its name. To understand pho, we have to travel back centuries to a Vietnam that looked completely different from the one we know today. Long before skyscrapers stood over Hanoi, and before motorcycles filled its streets, Vietnam was a land shaped by rivers. The mighty Red River carried rich soil across the north, creating one of the most fertile farming regions in Asia. Generation after generation, families depended on these waters to grow rice, the crop that would become the foundation of Vietnamese civilization. Rice wasn't simply food, it was survival. Children grew up helping their parents plant rice beneath the burning summer sun. Entire villages worked together during harvest season, knowing that one failed crop could mean hunger for thousands. As rice farming expanded, Vietnamese cooks became remarkably creative. Rice was steamed, ground into flour, pressed into paper-thin wrappers, fermented into wine, and eventually transformed into delicate white noodles that were soft, light, and surprisingly satisfying. These rice noodles would one day become the heart of pho. But another ingredient was still missing. For most of Vietnamese history, beef was rarely eaten. That might sound surprising today, considering beef pho is the dish's most famous version. Yet for centuries, cows were simply too valuable to slaughter. They pulled plows through muddy rice fields. They carried heavy supplies between villages. They represented wealth for farming families, whose livelihoods depended entirely on agriculture. Killing a healthy ox for food would have been like destroying your most important farming tool. Instead, Vietnamese families relied on fish from nearby rivers, pork raised in village homes, ducks, chickens, and vegetables gathered from the surrounding countryside. Beef appeared only on very rare occasions. So if Vietnamese people barely ate beef, how did beef become the defining ingredient of pho? The answer arrived from thousands of kilometers away. It came not with traders, but with an empire. During the second half of the 19th century, France expanded its colonial ambitions across Southeast Asia. By the 1880s, French forces had taken control of much of Vietnam, eventually forming what became known as French Indochina. The occupation changed almost every part of Vietnamese life. New roads connected distant cities. Railways stretched across the countryside. European-style buildings began replacing traditional architecture. French cafes appeared beside ancient temples. But perhaps the most unexpected change happened inside the kitchen. Unlike most Vietnamese farmers, the French had a deep love for beef. They consumed steaks, roasts, rich broths, and countless dishes that required large numbers of cattle. As demand increased, slaughterhouses expanded around Hanoi and other northern cities. For the first time in Vietnamese history, beef bones became available in enormous quantities. To French cooks, those bones were little more than leftovers. To struggling Vietnamese workers, they were an opportunity. No one could have predicted that what the French considered waste would eventually become the foundation of Vietnam's most famous national dish. And that single discovery would change culinary history forever. The French never intended to create Vietnam's national dish. In fact, they probably never imagined that the leftovers from their own kitchens would inspire one of the world's most beloved soups. Yet history has a strange way of transforming ordinary moments into extraordinary legacies. As French slaughterhouses expanded across northern Vietnam during the late 19th century, thousands of beef bones were discarded every single week. Wealthy Europeans wanted the finest cuts of meat, while the bones, tendons, and scraps were often sold cheaply or simply thrown away. For ordinary Vietnamese families, these leftovers represented something incredibly rare: a source of flavor, a source of nutrition, and perhaps most importantly, a source of possibility. Instead of wasting the bones, local cooks began simmering them in enormous iron pots over charcoal fires. They quickly discovered that after hours of slow cooking, the bones released a rich, clear broth, unlike anything they had tasted before. But the broth alone wasn't enough. It needed a soul, so they reached for the ingredient that had always defined Vietnamese life: rice noodles. Freshly made every morning, the soft white noodles slipped perfectly into the fragrant broth. Thin slices of beef were added only at the very end, allowing the heat of the soup to cook them gently. Then came spring onions, herbs, and spices that filled the air with an unforgettable aroma. The result was simple, affordable, comforting, and unlike anything Vietnam had ever eaten before. No expensive ingredients, no royal banquet, no elaborate presentation. Just a bowl that could warm a laborer's hands before sunrise and keep him full for an entire day. Soon, word began to spread. Before dawn each morning, street vendors balanced wooden shoulder poles across their backs, carrying one container filled with steaming broth and another packed with noodles, bowls, chopsticks, herbs, and beef. As they walked through Hanoi's quiet streets, they called out to customers in soft voices: workers leaving for construction sites, porters heading to the railway stations, market sellers preparing for another exhausting day. Everyone knew the sound. Within minutes, people gathered around tiny stools placed along the roadside. The broth was poured first, followed by noodles, beef, herbs, and finally a sprinkle of chopped spring onions. Steam rose into the cold morning air. The first spoonful was always the same: hot, fragrant, deeply satisfying. For many families, it became more than breakfast. It became part of daily life. Yet one mystery still remains. Where did the name pho actually come from? Historians have argued about this question for decades. One popular theory suggests The name came from the French word feu, meaning fire, inspired by the famous French beef stew, pot au feu. At first glance, the idea seems convincing. Both dishes rely on slowly simmered beef broth. Both became popular during French colonial rule. And both require patience rather than expensive ingredients. But many food historians remain unconvinced. The flavors are completely different. The cooking techniques are different. And there is no historical document proving that Vietnamese cooks simply copied the French recipe. Another theory points toward an older Vietnamese noodle dish called Giao Tro, made with water buffalo meat. Some researchers believe pho evolved naturally from local noodle traditions before French influence introduced beef in greater quantities. In reality, the answer is probably somewhere between the two. Pho wasn't copied from France, nor was it created entirely in isolation. It was born where two culinary worlds collided. French access to beef, Vietnamese mastery of rice noodles, Chinese influences in spices and noodle making, combined together by ordinary street vendors who were simply trying to feed hungry people. History often remembers kings, generals, and emperors, but it rarely remembers the anonymous cooks whose recipes quietly changed the world. No monument stands for the inventor of pho. No portrait hangs in a museum. Whoever created the first bowl almost certainly died without knowing that one day people on every continent would speak its name. And yet, the greatest challenge pho would ever face was still ahead. Within just a few decades, Vietnam would be plunged into war, famine, and division. Many believed pho would disappear forever. Instead, it would become stronger than ever. By the middle of the 20th century, pho had become a familiar sight across northern Vietnam. Every morning before dawn, the streets of Hanoi filled with the comforting aroma of slowly simmered broth. Office workers, students, laborers, and merchants all began their day with the same steaming bowl. It seemed as though pho had finally found its place. But history had other plans. In 1954, everything changed. After years of fighting, the French colonial empire collapsed following the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Vietnam was divided into two separate nations. The communist government controlled the north. The south became a separate state backed by Western powers. Families who had lived together for generations suddenly found themselves separated by politics, fear, and uncertainty. More than 1 million people fled from North Vietnam to the south, carrying only what they could fit into small bags and wooden carts. Among the things they refused to leave behind was pho. Street vendors packed their cooking pots. Families carried handwritten recipes. Restaurant owners rebuilt their businesses hundreds of kilometers away. And as people migrated south, pho traveled with them. But the pho waiting in Saigon would not remain the same. Southern Vietnam offered an entirely different landscape. The climate was warmer. Fresh herbs grew almost all year round. Markets overflowed with bean sprouts, Thai basil, lime, coriander, chili peppers, and tropical vegetables. Southern cooks were famous for their love of bold flavors. Instead of copying the northern recipe exactly, they adapted it. The broth became slightly sweeter. Larger portions of herbs appeared beside every bowl. Bean sprouts added freshness and crunch. Lime brought brightness. Fresh chilies gave the soup a fiery kick. Soon, two different styles of pho existed. In the north, Hanoi remained loyal to simplicity. The broth was clear and deeply savory. Only a few herbs decorated the bowl. Every ingredient respected the flavor of the beef itself. In the south, Saigon embraced abundance. The bowls became larger. The herbs became richer. The flavors became brighter, and more colorful. Neither version was better. They simply reflected two different regions and two different ways of seeing the same dish. Then came another tragedy. In the 1960s, Vietnam entered one of the most devastating wars in modern history. Bombs fell across cities. Entire villages disappeared. Millions of civilians were forced from their homes. Food became increasingly difficult to find. For many families, even a simple bowl of pho became a luxury. Beef was scarce. Bones were difficult to obtain. Spices became expensive. Street vendors struggled just to keep their businesses alive. Some cooks quietly replaced beef with chicken. Others reduced the amount of meat and focused on creating a richer broth using whatever ingredients remained available. People stood in long queues before sunrise, hoping there would still be enough soup when their turn arrived. Sometimes there was, sometimes there wasn't, yet something remarkable happened, even during war. Pho never disappeared. In refugee camps, people spoke about the pho they remembered from home. Soldiers dreamed about returning to their favorite street vendors after the fighting ended. Families passed recipes from one generation to the next, determined that the dish would survive, even if everything else was lost. For many Vietnamese people, pho had become far more than food. It had become a memory, a reminder of home, a reminder that even during history's darkest moments, comfort could still be found inside a simple bowl of soup. When the war finally ended in 1975, another extraordinary journey was about to begin. This time, pho would leave Vietnam entirely, and before long, the whole world would discover its unforgettable taste. When the Vietnam War finally ended in 1975, the guns fell silent, but for millions of Vietnamese families, the hardest chapter of their lives was only beginning. Entire cities had been left in ruins. Businesses had disappeared. Homes had been destroyed. Families had been separated forever. Many people realized they had only one choice: leave Vietnam. Over the next several years, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children escaped by sea in small wooden fishing boats. Others crossed dangerous borders through jungles and mountains, hoping to find safety in another country. These refugees would later become known around the world as the Boat People. Their journeys were unimaginably dangerous. Some boats drifted across the South China Sea for days, without enough food or drinking water. Violent storms destroyed fragile wooden vessels. Many people never reached land. Those who survived eventually found new homes in countries such as the United States, Canada, Australia, France, and the United Kingdom. Although they had lost almost everything, they refused to leave behind one part of their identity. Their food. Family recipes were carefully remembered. Cooking traditions were passed from parents to children. And among all those treasured recipes, pho remained the most important. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the first Vietnamese restaurants began opening outside Vietnam. Many were incredibly small. Some had only a handful of tables. Others were little more than family kitchens, serving neighbors. There were no expensive decorations, no celebrity chefs, no luxury dining rooms. Only a large pot of broth quietly simmering for hour after hour. Curious local customers often had no idea how to pronounce the name. Some called it pho. Others said pho. Restaurant owners smiled politely before explaining that it was pronounced pho. One bowl was enough to surprise almost everyone. Unlike many soups, pho wasn't heavy. The broth was crystal clear yet incredibly rich. Fresh herbs added brightness. Rice noodles made the meal comforting without feeling overwhelming. Thin slices of beef, cooked gently, sat inside the steaming broth, within seconds. People who had never tasted Vietnamese food before kept coming back. Then they brought their friends. Soon, newspapers began writing about pho. Food critics praised its balance and simplicity. Travel magazines described it as one of Asia's greatest comfort foods. Without expensive advertising, without massive restaurant chains, pho spread almost entirely through word of mouth. By the 1990s, Vietnamese restaurants were opening across major cities around the world. What had once been a humble breakfast, sold from a wooden shoulder pole in Hanoi, had quietly become an international sensation. And yet, pho's greatest transformation was still waiting to happen. As pho spread across the globe, something remarkable began to happen. It was no longer just a meal for Vietnamese families. It became a meal for everyone. Students discovered it after long days at university. Phosis workers found comfort in a steaming bowl during cold winter evenings. Travelers searched for the best pho shops hidden inside narrow alleyways. Professional chefs studied its broth for years. Trying to understand how something so simple could possess such incredible depth of flavor, many eventually realized the secret wasn't hidden in a single ingredient. It was hidden in time. Authentic pho cannot be rushed. A proper broth gently simmers for 10, sometimes 12, and occasionally even 24 hours. During that time, beef bones slowly release collagen, minerals and flavor into the clear broth. Charred onions add sweetness. Roasted ginger brings warmth. Cinnamon, stars anise, cloves, black cardamom, coriander seeds, and other carefully balanced spices create an aroma unlike any other soup in the world. Every chef guards that balance differently. Some families refuse to reveal recipes that have remained secret for 4 generations. Others insist their broth should never become cloudy. Some believe the bones must be washed 3 separate times. Others argue the spices should only be added during the final hours. Every restaurant claims to have discovered the perfect method. Yet no 2 bowls ever taste exactly the same. That may be the greatest beauty of pho. There isn't one authentic recipe. There are thousands. Each one tells the story of a different family, a different city, a different generation. Today, Vietnam celebrates National Pho Day every year, honoring the dish that has become one of the country's greatest cultural symbols. From the quiet streets of Hanoi to the bustling avenues of Ho Chi Minh City, pho remains a daily ritual. Before dawn, vendors still light charcoal fires. The broth still simmers through the night. The first customers still arrive while the streets are waking up. In many places, very little has changed. And yet, almost everything has. What began as a simple meal for ordinary workers is now recognized across the world. It has appeared in international food festivals, Michelin-recognized restaurants, travel documentaries, and countless must-try lists. But despite all its fame, pho has never forgotten where it came from. Its story is not one of luxury. It is not the story of kings, emperors, or wealthy merchants. It is the story of ordinary people who found hope in difficult times. It was shaped by farmers who spent their lives in rice fields, by anonymous street vendors who woke long before sunrise, by mothers who carefully passed recipes to their children, by refugees who crossed oceans, carrying little more than memories of home, and by every generation that refused to let its traditions disappear. History often celebrates great battles. It remembers powerful rulers. It records the rise and fall of empires. Yet sometimes, the greatest stories are not written by kings. They are quietly served in a bowl, because every spoonful of pho carries the echoes of colonial rule, the hardship of war, the pain of migration, and the determination of a nation that never stopped rebuilding itself. That is why pho is more than Vietnam's national dish. It is a symbol of resilience, a symbol of identity, a symbol of survival. So the next time you see steam rising from a fresh bowl of pho, pause for just a moment. Look beyond the noodles, beyond the herbs, beyond the rich broth. Because what you're holding isn't simply one of the world's greatest soups. You're holding more than a century of courage, more than a century of tradition, more than a century of memories, all carefully preserved inside a single bowl. And perhaps that's the most extraordinary part of this story. The people who first created pho will probably never be known. Their names have disappeared into history. Their faces were never painted. Their voices were never recorded. But their creation outlived empires. It survived occupation. It survived famine. It survived war. It crossed continents. It united cultures. And today, every time someone anywhere in the world takes that very first spoonful, their story lives on once again. This wasn't just the history of pho. It was the story of how hope, resilience, and tradition can survive anything, one bowl at a time. Thank you for watching.